Someone may think, was that a yellow edition of the Bible? No, it was not a yellow letter edition. But rather, we've been emphasizing worship for a number of weeks, and this is the last lesson. Originally, when we started studying worship, the plan was to have 2 general lessons about worship and then look at each specific act of worship. 2 + 5 = 7. And as I progressed through the series, I thought it kind of begs for one more lesson to be preached. And this lesson would kind of go back and look at, reemphasize some ideas from the first 2 lessons, and then kind of help us, hopefully, to think in terms of kind of us in worship. Yes, worship. But today, see, the emphasis, it's about God. We had noticed the definition of worship from Merriam-Webster is to honor or reverence as a divine being or supernatural power. Now, obviously, we think in terms of, honoring God. Sadly, sometimes people can take something or person. It's not God. And honor or reverence it or him or her as divine. To regard with great or extravagant respect, honor, or devotion, such as like a celebrity worshipped by her fans. So that's just the English definition. Now somebody says, well, let's get more detailed. The Greek word from which worship comes, proskuneo, it's from, pros, which is towards, and kaneo, which is to kiss. And so this is why we sometimes hear to kiss the hand towards. In fact, I've heard it expressed this way by actually several people. It's as if mankind blowing a kiss to heaven. Now, if we were to say, well, let me see some evidence of this. Well, Thayer's lexicon, it says of proskuneo, to kiss the hand to or towards one in token of reverence. Then it also says among the Orientals, especially the Persians, to fall upon the knees and touch the ground with the forehead as an expression of profound reverence. Now there's more said about this, and we said more about this previously, but I want us to kind of center once again, thinking about this idea of to kiss the hand towards. Yes, a good bit of my life I had heard worship, proskuneo, to kiss the hand towards. And I hadn't given a lot of thought about what exactly does that mean? And how does that help me better understand this word worship? And so I got to thinking about, what about this kissing thing? And here's a picture of Dennis Thatcher greets U.S. First Lady Nancy Reagan by kissing her hand in 1988. Now, if you were to say, what does this represent? You could say, at the very simplest, it was a greeting. You might also say it was a show of respect on his part towards the First Lady of the United States of America. Here's a Bulgarian woman kissing the hand of Emperor Ferdinand in 1916. And if we said, well, what did she mean by this? We might say, a greeting. We might say respect. We might also go on and say kind of a deference, an honor, as she is but just a peasant woman, and here he is the emperor. But then we find sometimes people use this kiss in even a greater way. This is Vice President of Brazil, José Alencar, kisses the ring on the right hand of Cardinal José Ferrer Falcão. Now, I'm not debating here the right or wrong of him kissing the guy's ring. We're going to have something to say about who we are to worship in a little bit. But if we were to say here, greeting. Well, kind of yes, but I think we would recognize that a kiss such as this meant so much more. It was more than just a greeting or just respect or just even deference. But it was a way, in fact, to honor that man. It was a way to I hesitate to go this far, but almost to worship the man. In Eastern Orthodox religions, you would find so many times people going up to an icon. Sometimes it was just a picture. Sometimes it might be a statue or a bust. And they would kiss it, or they might kiss their hands and touch it. And once again, well, what are they doing here? Well, we might say greeting or deference or respect. But it goes so much further than that. For them, it was homage, it was adoration, it was reverence, it was veneration. It's kind of all of this. Well, for most of us, this last picture and this one's kind of outside of our realm of reference. But now this one's not. That little baby there. And you know that as mom and dad kiss that baby on the cheek, it's a sign of affection, a sign of love, a sign of adoration even. And so for all of these things, kissing might be a greeting, deference, respect, homage, worship, adoration, reverence, veneration, affection, respectfulness, honor, submission, love. All of these things kissing can kind of show. You see, that's what worship does. To kiss the hand towards. When we worship God, it's our not just simply greeting and respect, but showing our deference, homage, worship, adoration, reverence, veneration, affection, respectfulness, honor, and submission and love to God. All of this happens when we worship God. Yeah, I better understand the idea of to kiss the hand towards and what it means and how it illustrates the idea of what worship is. And so when I have heard then or seen written someone say, well, worship is like blowing the kiss toward heaven. No, they're not being disrespectful in any way whatsoever. They're rather recognizing this proskuneo, to kiss the hand towards, and it's God that this is directed toward. He's in heaven. And so it's as if we're blowing a kiss to heaven. I'd have to say, I hope that as we enter a period of worship, and as we go through each of these acts of worship, the singing, the praying, the giving, the Lord's Supper, the time of teaching or preaching, that it is our kissing the hand towards heaven. We'd emphasized this, that first lesson, about 8 weeks ago. But we'd also looked at this. In fact, to me, this is very interesting how that a Bible in its simple footnote can so help to understand the meaning of a word. And I know you can't read that from where you are, but in Matthew chapter 2, verse 2, you find worship Him. And this is within the context of the wise men and Jesus and Herod, etc. Well, if we're going to say, what's that footnote for worship Him? You find it there in the margin. And I know you can't read that either, so here's what it says. The Greek word denotes an act of reverence, whether paid to a creature or the Creator. And it gives some references, helpful references if someone's going to study a little bit further. But note it's an act of reverence. An act, well, it is something that we do. And so it is that as there's the praying, as there's the singing, as there's the Lord's Supper, the giving, the teaching, here are acts, things done, but it's joined with our hearts and our mind because it is an act of reverence. If it was an act devoid of heart and mind, it's ritual and mere ritual and ritual only. and it's not pleasing to God. But as well, if a person felt all of, as it were, what he should feel towards God, but he did not do as God said, once again, that worship is not what God desires and expects. We're not emphasizing today John 4:24. That's not the emphasis. The emphasis had been the first lesson, second lesson, and then as we studied throughout the various acts of worship. You see, John 4:24 speaks of how our worship is to be in spirit and in truth. But I would suggest to you that this definition of worship emphasizes that very thing. That our worship is to be in spirit and in truth. In spirit, it's to be from a reverent mind and heart and attitude. But in truth, well, if it's an act of reverence, with all that reverence means that I submit to God and what He teaches, and it's an act based on that, yes, it's in spirit and in truth. But worship has got to be directed towards the right object. And that's kind of the emphasis here today. Our worship's directed towards the right object. In Exodus 34 verse 14 you read, "You shall worship no other God, for the Lord whose name is jealous is a jealous God." And in Matthew 4:10, then Jesus said to him, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and Him only shall you serve." It's got to be towards God, you see. Not idols. And we have several warnings against this, particularly as you would go to the Ten Commandments, beginning in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 3. "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." And so here you have no other gods, no idols. Then in verse 5, "And you shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me." And so not only do we have no other gods, we're not to bow down or serve them. So no idols, but also not men. In Acts chapter 10, you have the story of Peter and Cornelius. And Cornelius is so grateful as Peter comes that he falls down at his feet and worships him. But in verse 26, Peter lifted him up, saying, "Stand up, I too am a man." So no, you don't worship men. Neither do you worship angels. Now, as you think about who this is, John, in the book of Revelation, you might think, John, you're an apostle. John, you have now written down the majority of this book. You're at the very close of it. You know better. But John is so overwhelmed at what he has seen. Verse 8, "And I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things. And when I heard and saw them, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who showed them to me." And I do think he knew better. It's just he's so overwhelmed with everything that he's seen. And then in verse 9, "But he said to me," the angel said to me, "You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers the prophets, and with those who keep the words of this book. Worship God." So not only are we not to worship idols, we're not to worship men, and we're not to worship angels. God is the proper object of worship. And as I mentioned, this is kind of the emphasis here today. God is the one we worship. In John 4:23, "But the hour is coming, and now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, For the Father is seeking such people to worship Him. That passage we so often go to about worship. And we kind of more emphasize that spirit and truth part. But right now, let's emphasize that Father part. We are worshiping God. Everything about what we do, it's heaven-centered. It's to God above. Not idols, not angels, not men. It's directed towards heaven, the Father. And so we find, like in Psalm 29, verse 2, ascribe to the Lord the glory due His name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. And in Psalm 95, beginning of verse 1, O come, let us sing to the Lord, let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into His presence with thanksgiving, and let us make a joyful noise to Him with songs of praise. Once again, both these passages, all is directed towards heaven, all is directed towards God. We worship God because He deserves our worship. He's our Creator. Psalm 95, verses 6 and 7, O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our God, our Maker. For He is our God. We are the people of His pasture and the sheep of His hand. Today, if you hear His voice, He's our Creator. There's the reason to worship the God of heaven. He's described as the great God in Psalm 86, beginning of verse 9. All the nations you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and shall glorify your name. For you are great and do wondrous things. You alone are God. So we worship Him. He's our Creator. He's the great God. As I mentioned, this is what we want to emphasize. Worship's all about Him. Now, we're going to take 3 of the acts of worship and just see how that there's passages that emphasize this very thing. We're not looking at all 5, and part of that's kind of time's sake. And part of that, well, if you've established it with the 3, certainly that would have established it with the 5. And so let's see, first of all, our singing is to God. Our singing is to God. In Colossians 3:16, one of the number of passages that speak of singing in the New Testament, it said, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. You can't get away from that verse, but thinking of not only the singing psalms, hymns, spiritual songs connected with thanksgiving, but also how this all is directed towards God. Last week in listening in the car to, this happens to be a USB drive of Freed Hardeman Lectures of 2018, and it just so happened last week hit on about 3 lessons from Brother Dan Winkler. And one of the things that he was emphasizing with regards to worship was gratitude, and how that gratitude ought to be even a basis of our worship to God. And so you see here, you sing psalms, hymns, spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. If we come in these doors with an attitude of gratitude towards God, certainly we have an attitude of worship. But as we would see here, it's directed towards God. And so we also see in the Old Testament, once again with singing and God. Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes. To the Lord I will sing. I will make melody to the Lord, the God of Israel. So the singing at that time was to God. Psalm 47, verse 6. Sing praises to God. Sing praises. Sing praises to our King. Sing praises. Again, it's directed towards God. In Psalm 146, verse 2, I will praise the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praises to my God while I have my being. It's almost like as long as I have my being, as long as I live, I will not only be praising God, I will be singing praises to my God. And so here, with regards to the New Testament, the Old Testament as well, Singing was to God. Next, let's just kind of notice here very quickly about praying. And our praying is to God. I want you to notice the prayer of dedication at Solomon's temple. Now that prayer is lengthy and we don't have time, and it doesn't even suit the purpose just to read the entirety of the prayer. But I want you to see some of the prayer. 1 Kings chapter 8, beginning of verse 22. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel, and spread out his hands toward heaven, notice, toward heaven, and said, O Lord, God of Israel, there's no God like you in heaven above or earth beneath, keeping covenant and showing steadfast love to your servants who walk before you with all their heart, who have kept with your servant David my father what you declared to him. You spoke with your mouth, and with your hand have fulfilled it this day. You know, as you begin to see here, you see this prayer was directed towards the God of heaven. And then as you get to chapter 8, verse 30, he says, and listen to the plea of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. And listen in heaven, your dwelling place. And when you hear, forgive. The reason I put this verse there is because he uses that phrase, listen in heaven. He's praying to God. When you listen in heaven, well, that might be helping those people to understand that ultimately heaven's a dwelling place of God and not this physical structure, the temple. But actually, this phrase in heaven within this chapter is found 9 times. And the emphasis down there, here in heaven. Why? Because they are praying to God. Yes, our prayers are to God. Jesus, when he prayed, he went up to that mountain, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And we find that we are to pray to God. As he gave that model prayer, teaching us how to pray, he said in Matthew 6, verse 9, pray then like this, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. So whether it's the singing or whether it's the praying, we kind of walk away with, hey, this is to God. This is to God. Our giving. Sometimes we think, well, this is one of the most simplest things. We just kind of put the money in the basket or the tray. But I want to call attention to giving, to emphasize again, the giving, it's to God. In 1 Chronicles 29, verse 9, this was that giving with regards to the temple. Then the people rejoiced because they had given willingly, for with a whole heart they had offered freely to the Lord. They were giving for the temple, but yet they recognized that they were giving to the Lord. And in Psalm 116, verse 12, what may I give to the Lord for all the good things which he has done for me? In Proverbs 3, verse 9, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Sometimes people might be thinking, well, we're giving and this is going to pay the light bill. This is going to, pay the salaries. This is going to help with benevolence. This is going to help with some mission work. This is going to... In reality, yes, it's being used in that fashion. But we need to understand our giving, it's to the Lord. And as elders and deacons consider, okay, now, how do we use these free will gifts that have been made? How do we spend God's money? As I mentioned, we looked at singing, prayer, giving. And if we look at the Lord's Supper and preaching, once again, the idea is, it's to God. It's not about me. It's not about me. Are there going to be things that happen in worship? I'll say this, that are a distraction. Yeah, it will. And it may be the simplest of things, maybe a child crying. And let me just say this, I'm very glad that there are children. Happy if they don't cry, but okay if they do. It may be some kind of incidental, strange, even laughable thing. Tish tells about when she was a little girl that the two ladies, they had hairnets on and they had the clips. And they kind of dozed off and they fell against each other and the clips got hooked to each other. And it was kind of amusing to her, and she remembers it as an adult happening when she was a child. There can be distractions. But ultimately, we need our attention, our mind, and our heart directed towards heaven above. With regards to what we do, I mentioned first of all, the singing. And an interesting thing, I made mention, listened to, it's about 3 lessons last week by Dan Winkler that were from Free Hardeman Lectures. And he referenced worship. One of the things he emphasizes gratitude. He also referenced worship, and he said this. He said there was a time, and it happened many years in the congregation that he had preached previously. He said an elder and a deacon sat down behind him, and he thought, oh no. And it's not because they were elder or deacon, but they could not carry a tune. But they would sing out. And it was kind of distracting, harder for him to sing. But then he realized, I need to work on my attitude. And he says he flipped it. He flipped it to when, if they would sat behind him, he was thankful and grateful because they were the best example of someone who worshiped God and participated in worship and put themselves into worship. Now, they couldn't sing the best, but they understood this. It's not only those who can sing in tune or in key or in harmony that's God expecting to sing, but He's expecting everyone to participate. And they did. He said they were a great example and encouraged me in my worship when I let my attitude change. And see, here kind of is the point. It's not about me, it's about God. I didn't like that song. It's not about me, it's about God. That song's a little bit harder to sing. Well, do your best with it. But again, it's not about me, it's about God. Well, I like this song leader better than that one, or I don't like that one as much as that one. It's not about me, it's about God. I've heard sometimes people say, well, prayers don't have to be everlasting to be of eternal value. Usually they say that if they don't like very long prayers. And then some, and I'll say this, if it's a personal, I like the fact that names are mentioned. And I've had people before ask me, was my name mentioned in prayer? And I'm so glad I can now say, yes, your name was mentioned in prayer. Makes for a little bit longer of a prayer. But there again, it's not about me, it's about God. It's about God. Had somebody tell me that he said, we this is another church, different place. We got some folks that we start at 10 and literally they walk out at 11. No matter what's going on or if we're at the end, they get up and they walk out at 11. It's not about me. It's about God. I don't like that subject. I wish you wouldn't preach on that subject. It's not about me. It's about God. And as we finish up, and yes, we are finished now with a series on worship, I hope that we will understand and have a mindset of all that word kiss means, that it is like blowing a kiss towards heaven. It's this worship. These acts of worship are the way that I express my adoration, my veneration, my worship to God. And it's not about an idol or angels or men. It's not about me. It's about God. Worship. It's about God. If we could assist you in your obedience this morning, I beg of you, please consider, please know, yes, you've sinned. Because of that sin, you're separated from God and lost. But God in His grace, His mercy, out of His love, He will save. To that end, Jesus was sent to this earth, lived, and then died on that cross, shedding His blood, the sacrifice for me, for you. But we must respond, accepting that forgiveness in the way that He has told us, with faith, then turning from our sins, which is repentance, to confess that faith, and then to be baptized for the forgiveness of sins. We could assist you with that this morning. If there's a need for prayer, we'd be glad to take the time and pray for you. If you need to come, please come as we stand and sing.